Hi, you guys. Welcome back. And of course, if you are new to this channel, welcome. My name is Tracy, and in this video, I'm going to tell you guys about the Poltergeist visitation at the Battersea Mystery House. So stay tuned. It all started on November 29th, 1928, and this story takes place in the London suburb of Battersea. And on this afternoon, Frederick Robinson was in the kitchen of his home when he started to hear a pattering type of sound. And he knew that it was not raining outside, so he decided to go and investigate to try to find out where this sound was coming from. As he followed the noise, he found in his conservatory on the glass ceiling that there were a few pennies, some small lumps of coal, and some lumps of soda on the roof of his conservatory that he could see through the window. He thought it was rather strange and that possibly, maybe there was a prankster outside who was throwing these things onto his roof. And as he was actually standing there looking up, another small lump of coal hit the glass as he was watching. So he quickly went outside to the garden to see if anyone was out there. And of course, he was unable to locate anybody. So he went along with his day after this, and later he even got up on a ladder to remove the lumps of coal and the pennies from the roof. Now, after he had placed the lumps of coal in their stock of coal and put the pennies in his pocket, he thought that this issue was completely resolved. But boy, was he wrong. This was only the beginning of basically a poltergeist visitation that was going to last weeks. And this story actually was captured by the media as well. And there was even a lot of psychics and ghost hunters who came to this house in Battersea to try to find out what exactly was happening there. Living in the house was 86-year-old Henry Robinson, along with his 4 adult children. And those children are named Frederick, who I just told you a little story about at the beginning of this video, and Lila, as well as Kate and Mary. Now, Mary was actually already married to a Mr. Perkins. His name was George Perkins. And actually, a few months before, Mary and her 14-year-old son, Peter, had just moved back into this Battersea house because Peter's father and Mary's husband, George Perkins, passed away. And so now all of these siblings, along with their father, who's mostly bedridden, are now living together in the Battersea house. The next incident took place on December 2nd of 1928, and once again, Frederick was home and he began to hear the pattering noise or the shower of objects falling on the conservatory roof once again. So this time, rather than going into the conservatory, Frederick decided to run out into the garden immediately, where he jumped up on top of the wall and noticed that there was absolutely no one around. Now, as he was outside, the objects just stopped falling. Now, on the very next day, it happened again. But this time, Frederick was not alone in the house. His 14-year-old nephew was also home, and so when they heard the noise, both men ran out into the yard once again, and again they could find no one around who could have been throwing the objects at their house. So they're quite baffled at this point, and so Frederick asked Peter to run off into the street to find a policeman so that the policeman could then come back and they could make a report. So it didn't take very long for Peter to find this policeman, and so he brought him in and they started to show him the damage that had taken place. Now on this day, a larger lump of coal actually fell to the conservatory roof, but this time it actually broke through the glass. So now the glass roof is damaged and broken. So they show the police officer all this damage, all of the items that seem to just be falling from the sky. And then the policeman, using his uniform of authority, actually searched much more effectively than Frederick could himself. He went into neighboring gardens to find out if anyone was around. But once again, even though the police officer was able to look much more thoroughly, they still found no one around who could have been the one throwing the object. When Frederick and the police officer made it back into the garden of Frederick's home, they heard the sound of another object falling onto the conservatory roof. And so Peter, who was inside cleaning up the mess from earlier, he was there when this object fell, and so he shouted to them, "It was a penny!" And just then, the police officer looked up into the sky just as a second penny fell down to meet the first. So at this point, they're actually witnessing these objects falling straight down from the sky. And that's when the police officer and Frederick noticed that if someone was actually throwing these objects, they would be kind of coming in at some type of an arc due to the throw coming from ground level. But in the case that they had just witnessed, they saw the penny fall straight down from the sky. As the police officer was looking up into the sky, trying to figure out where this penny came from, suddenly a small lump of coal fell straight down and hit him right in the helmet. And so they decided to take this inside and have a cup of tea while they discussed the issue at hand. So the policeman, Frederick, and Peter sat down at the table for a cup of tea, when suddenly a potato fell onto the table and rolled over to him. A potato. And so just then, all three looked up as a second potato actually materialized before their eyes and then simply fell straight down onto the table once again. That's when the policeman decided that it was time for him to go. And so he told the other two that, he'll keep his eye out on things, and he had to go. He was going to, make a report about this incident. On December 19th of 1928, the Robinson family actually had a washerwoman who came over and did their linens and laundry and things. So when she went to the family's outhouse and unlocked the door, as soon as she opened the door, she noticed that there was a fire in the middle of the floor of the room. So she ran off to get Frederick, who was the only other person home at the time, and the only other person who has a key to the outhouse. So neither of them claimed to have started this fire. So obviously it was once again a mystery. So this random fire was started, but that is not the end either. 3 days after the fire, a whole hour of mayhem began at 9 a.m. It began with loud banging noises, as if someone was actually banging all of the walls of the house with a sledgehammer. And this persisted for quite some time. And then, in the elderly Robinson's room, Because if you remember, Henry Robinson is the 86-year-old father, but he is mostly confined to his bed. Now, after all of this time where the banging was happening on the walls, suddenly in Henry Robinson's room, the window seemingly exploded. At first, they thought that someone might have thrown something through the window to break the window. But after searching everywhere, they could find no object that was actually there that could have come through the window to break it in such a way. And so this just added once again to the mystery. Now, this really frightened the elder Robinson, and so he didn't want to stay in his room any longer. Understandably, he was in a state of complete terror, like completely afraid to be in his own room or in his own bed anymore. So Frederick then ran out and ended up finding his neighbor, Mr. Bradbury, and he asked Mr. Bradbury if he could take his father into his home for a temporary period of time until they could kind of figure out what was going on at their house with all of these strange noises and strange occurrences that had been going on. So Mr. Bradbury agreed, and they moved Henry Robinson into the neighbor Bradbury's house. Now, this is when the next stage of this strange poltergeist visitation began to happen, and that is where furniture began to move all on its own. So as the two men began to help Henry Robinson up out of the bed so that he could then be moved, the chest of drawers began to sway and rock back and forth, even though no one was over there by the drawers at all, until finally they fell flat down on the floor. So as soon as the old man was out of the house, the hat stand in the hallway began to move on its own as well. And just as it was about to fall, Frederick went to grab the hat stand when suddenly it was then yanked right out of his hands and flung across the room so hard that the hat stand broke in two. Now, over the next couple of weeks, the damage being done to the house wasn't quite as severe, but it was still like little by little, this house was just being destroyed by some strange unseen force. There were broken windows. Almost every window in the back of the house was broken, along with the two windows in the front of the house that were broken. And let's not forget that the glass roof in the conservatory is also broken. Now, there's also reports of furniture being broken and flung across the room, things falling off the shelf. Many different ornaments for decoration had fallen and broken, which are all things that had never happened before. This all just kind of started that day when Frederick heard things falling onto the roof of his conservatory. So it all just kind of started on that strange day at the end of November 1928. This became a rather famous case of a poltergeist visitation. So of course, it did catch the interest of the media, and so many people began to hear about the incidents taking place at the Battersea Mystery House, is what they decided to call it. And so this attracted the attention of the famed ghost hunter Harry Price. Harry Price made his first visit to the Battersea Mystery House on January 19th, 1929. It was kind of like a last resort for the Robinsons to see if someone who is, well-versed in the paranormal could possibly help them to get to the bottom of this strange mystery going on. So after Harry Price introduced himself to the Robinson family, he asked if next time he came, if he could bring a reporter from the London Evening News. And so the Robinsons agreed, and Harry Price brought along the journalist, Mr. Gryce. Now, Price and Gryce were given a tour of the Battersea house once again by Frederick. And Frederick went around explaining all the strange occurrences that had been taking place at the house over the last weeks. And right away, almost immediately, that is when Harry Price recognized that what was going on here was actually a poltergeist. Now, as Frederick was standing in one room with Harry and Mr. Gryce, all three men heard a large thud come from the kitchen. And so they all hurried on over there to find out what exactly it was they were hearing. So when they made it into the kitchen, they saw that it was a wooden handled gas lighter that was actually just in the middle of the floor of the kitchen. And normally it's right next to the stove up on a counter. So that was an unexplained event that kind of happened while all of them were there. Now, the reporter, Mr. Gryce, rushed out of the house right then and there, and he made it back to his office in time to actually get this news out in their evening edition that very day. The next time that Price and Gryce visited the Battersea house, they learned that Frederick Robinson was actually arrested because the police were beginning to think that he was the one tormenting his own family because all of these strange incidents took place while Frederick was present. So while he was arrested, he was also put into kind of a psych ward type of thing where he was being psychologically tested and, you know, having all that stuff done to him as well. Now, along with arresting Frederick Robinson, the police also put an officer on guard in front of the Battersea house. Even though Frederick was removed from the house for possibly being the culprit here, nothing actually stopped by his removal. So therefore, the bangs continued, the strange flying objects continued, but it seems that the activity was about to be stepped up a notch. On the following Saturday evening, Mary Perkins, the mom of Peter, was setting the table in the dining room, and that's when the chairs actually began moving on their own. So Mary ran out of the dining room and into the hall, and that is when she turned around and saw the chairs were actually following her in a procession, like in a line. And when they came out into the room, Mary states that they simply turned around and marched themselves right back into the dining room. So when Mary got her nerve back up to re-enter the dining room, she went in and saw that all the chairs were stacked on top of the table. So she put the chairs back down, and after she removed the chairs from the top of the table, the chairs then placed themselves on top of the table once again. So of course, Mary ran outside to get the policeman who was standing watch out front, and she had him come in and to look at these chairs on the table. And of course, the police officer did not believe Mary and stated that she had to have placed those chairs on the table herself. The next day, it was now Kate's turn to witness a bizarre event in the house. So as Kate was in the kitchen, all of a sudden, a case was flung at her and actually hit her. And so she retreated out into the hallway. And as soon as she entered the hallway, an umbrella sprang out of the umbrella holder and opened up right before her eyes. And then later, Kate was in the kitchen with Peter when suddenly they both saw the chairs begin to vibrate and move. And so the two of them then ran outside, but continued to watch through the window where they could see the chairs actually kind of dancing around the room until all of a sudden they all fell to the floor at exactly the same time. There was so much for them to tell Harry Price and Mr. Gryce when they visited the house once again the following Monday. And so while they were sitting in the kitchen telling Price and Grice all about what had happened over the weekend, they all heard a loud thud coming from another room. And so they all got up and went into like the living room area, where they found a pair of boots in the middle of the floor, and inside one of the boots was a bronze cherub, and that item was an ornament that was normally sitting up on the mantelpiece. So that is when Kate and Mary Perkins decided that it was probably time to simply abandon the house. So they sent 14-year-old Peter to live on a long-term basis with relatives in the country, while the other two women, Kate and Mary, went to live with friends in Battersea. Now, on that following weekend, so many people gathered outside of the Battersea Mystery House just to gape at the house. There were so many people that the policemen actually had to come to the location as well, just to ensure that there wouldn't be a huge problem with the massive crowd that was beginning to form outside of the Mystery House. And this is when Harry Price actually got permission to do some investigation all alone inside the house. And so later on, it was also asked if a psychic medium could join Harry in his investigation. Now, he agreed to that, but he wasn't quite sure if he really liked what this medium kind of brought to the table, because all she could really sense in the house was that it was cold, but of course it was the middle of the winter and the house was cold. Now, as the medium, along with Harry Price, was investigating, nothing really happened. When they came back downstairs after looking upstairs, they noticed a piece of soap lying in the middle of the floor. The next day, Frederick Robinson was released from the jail, and he moved directly right back into the Battersea Mystery House. And so, Kate Robinson and Mary Perkins also moved back into the house. In hindsight, it has been realized that poltergeist visitations do generally include a focus person. And the events at the Battersea Mystery House were diminished by the time 14-year-old Peter was finally removed from the home to live with relatives in the country. Aside from that one stray bar of soap, no other incidents took place after Peter was removed from the home. Now, the focus person is usually a teenager or a child of some kind, so he fits that description. And he also had a traumatic experience recently happen with the death of his father. And once his father died, he and his mother had to move into this already somewhat crowded house with all these other relatives. So it is quite possible that this was a poltergeist visitation and that the focus of the poltergeist was Peter. After the family ended up renting a different house in the Battersea area, there were no other incidents in the original Battersea Mystery House, and they were able to live out the rest of their lives just like average, normal, everyday people without poltergeist bothering them every day. Well, that about wraps it up for this video. So if you like this video, be sure to click that like button. And of course, if you're a viewer but not yet a subscriber, I would love for you to click subscribe right under this video. And once you have subscribed, you can then click the bell to receive notification each and every time that I upload a new video. Thank you guys so much for watching and spending your time with me. I love you, and I'll see you next time. Bye.